and we are recording now. And I guess I just kind of want to open the floor. If we have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat. Give you a couple seconds to go ahead and ask those. And if there's none, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. And hello, Lily. All right, I'm not seeing any questions before we begin. So I have the honor to introduce you all today to Gail Burrill and Joelle. Their session today is Nonprofit Leadership Overview. And I'm going to go ahead and let Gail and Joelle take it over from here. Gail and Joelle.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, JM.
Thank you, everybody.
So we'll go ahead and get started here. Again, this is me, Gail, and I'm going to just show my video at least for a little bit so I can say hello. It's so wonderful, and I'm so excited to be able to present to all of you today. I am the Eastern Region Executive Director with Conservation Legacy, and I'm thrilled for our amazing VISTA program and all the work that you all are doing. I'm slightly sad because I was supposed to be in person with all of you and learning alongside of you, and so I'm missing that opportunity for that connection, but thankful to have the opportunity to work with you right now. And Joelle and I will give a little more of our background as the presentation goes, but we wanted to start with a couple of our own chat questions for you. So Trish, if you can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. First and most important question, given waffles, pancakes, or French toast, which is your go-to breakfast choice? It may say something about your personality. All right, Josh is gonna grab the totals, but there's a lot. I think pancakes is falling into the end there. A lot of French toast and waffles. Okay, moving on to the next question. If we can go to the next slide. This one's a little more detailed than the first one, but we will get reports on the first responses at the end. But this one says, how would you assess your own experience in nonprofits? You only need to enter into the chat a number, but number one is, hey, I'm just starting. Consider me a blank slate. Number two is, I've volunteered at some organizations. Number three, I've either worked with an organization or maybe you've been in a leadership role, in a volunteer leadership role with an organization. Number four, I've led in most key areas of nonprofits. Those could be fundraising, HR, finance, or other areas. And number five, you consider me an expert. I have contributed to governance and to board in addition to everything else. All right, well, thank you for entering in all your numbers. Trish, if you could go to the next slide. While Josh helps give us a detailed report both on waffles, pancakes, and French toast, as well as nonprofit background, Joelle and I will give you a little more information about ourselves. So these are our LinkedIn profiles. We want to make sure you had those in case afterwards you want to connect or have some questions. I'd love to stay connected at the great work that you're doing. I have about 20 years in nonprofit management. I went to the University of Vermont and then got an executive certificate in nonprofit management from Georgetown University. But pretty soon I had a business degree at the University of Vermont, and pretty soon I was looking at what I wanted to do with my life and how I could be most effective, and applying business principles to nonprofits is what I decided I wanted to do. So you have probably heard of some of the nonprofits I've worked with, and maybe some you haven't. Over 20 years in nonprofits, I worked with the Boys and Girls Club, American Red Cross, Habitat for Humanity, Starlight Children's Foundation, an organization called Outdoors for All, and one called the National Ability Center that work with people with disabilities and recreation. And now I'm so pleased I joined Conservation Legacy last fall. All of the work I've done has really focused on recreation, and most recently in my last 15 years, the outdoor side of things. And Joelle?
Hi, everyone. I'm going to turn my video on also while I'm chatting. I'm really excited to be with all of you today. I, like Gail, have been in the nonprofit sector for a long time, over 20 years. I went to Tufts University undergrad in Boston and actually was a Vista at the Boston Food Bank, was my first official job in the nonprofit sector. So I worked there for a year and then went on to other nonprofits such as Big Brothers Big Sisters, a community foundation, a human rights organization, and a variety of other nonprofits in Boston, and now I live in Utah. So I've worked here as well. And also have my master's in management from the Heller School at Brandeis, which is basically nonprofit management meets social policy. And have most recently been doing consulting and also working as an adjunct professor at a local university in Salt Lake. And I joined Conservation Legacy as interim development director last week. So really excited to be with you today to talk about nonprofits, which I'm a nonprofit junkie, so I love it.
I think as Joelle just mentioned, we tell you our backgrounds mostly because we want you to know we've probably been through it all. We know the challenges and the opportunities because we've seen it and experienced it directly. We're excited to hear your feedback throughout this presentation, for you to ask questions either in the chat if that's where you feel most comfortable, or go ahead and turn on your microphone and your camera and ask a question out loud. We know, looks like, Josh's going to give me the numbers now. It looks like most of you are pretty solidly kind of in the nonprofit space, maybe have some opportunities to look for leadership, but Josh, where did most people end up?
Can you read that? There was 1 for the first one, 2 for number 2, 18.5 for number 3,
All right.
half for 4, and then 0 for 5.
All right, that is awesome. Well, that's a great way for us to understand the background of who we're talking to and to make sure that we're presenting materials that are relevant to the work you do. But before Joelle kicks off our presentation with the next slide, I just want to say again, thanks. This work is very meaningful and important to all of us, I know, on the call, and we hope you can gather some great information today, and again, continue the conversation either through the chat afterwards. Find us on LinkedIn if you have some challenges or questions. Nonprofit management is tricky but exciting, and we look forward to helping you through that. All right, Joelle.
And I just want to underscore what Gail said. I have no problem if you want to post a question in the chat while we're talking. I prefer for this to be interactive as opposed to us just sort of lecturing and talking at you. So this is just a quick quote from an activist that I followed for many, many years, who's since passed away in the Boston area. And I just like to say that we are not do-gooders, but we're good doers. So that's it. I just like that quote, and I like Kip Tiernan. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to start by just talking about the nonprofit sector. Sounds like many of you are already well versed, so I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but we're going to talk a little bit about what is a nonprofit, types of nonprofits, and nonprofits versus for-profits. So what is a nonprofit? Super boring. You can move on to the next slide. Super boring legal definition is a group organized for purposes other than generating a profit, in which no part of the organization's income is distributed to its members, directors, or officers. So I always like to say that I think of nonprofits being not for profit, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to have a profit. So that's why I think the name is a little bit of a misnomer. And I really love this that I found online and that I've used for a few years. That charitable nonprofits embody the best of America. They provide a way for people to work together for the common good, transforming shared beliefs and hopes into actions. America's nonprofits feed, heal, shelter, educate, inspire, enlighten, and nurture people of every age, race, gender, and socioeconomic status from coast to coast, border to border, and beyond. So that's what you all are a part of. So we should all feel really good about it. Here are some nonprofit sector information by the numbers. The most recent data is from 2015, but you can see that there are approximately 1.56 million nonprofits registered in the United States. increase of 10% from 2005. The nonprofit sector contributed an estimated $985.4 billion to the U.S. economy. So we're a big part of what happens in this country. In 2017, $410 billion were given from individuals, foundations, and businesses. And an estimated 25% of adults volunteered in 2017. So we are an integral part of the U.S. economy and really important. So we're just going to quickly go through types of nonprofits on the next slide. I like this list. I stumbled upon it maybe 5-6 years ago, and I think it's a pretty decent list. So you can sort of see that on this slide. I'm not going to go through them, but I think what's interesting, the last one, foundations, a lot of people don't realize that foundations are also a nonprofit. What is different about nonprofits is they must give away 5% of their assets annually. So that distinguishes them a little bit from some of these other organizations. Also, just want to note, some people don't realize that there are a lot of hospitals that are nonprofit. Most of them are. Universities, schools, nonprofit. And actually, there are a lot of nonprofit prisons. More and more are becoming for-profit. But so it's interesting to note some of the other types of organizations that may be different than what you're working in that are nonprofit. Okay, the next slide, get a little bit more in depth, the difference between nonprofits and for-profits. Again, I think it sounds like many of you may already know a lot of this, so I will go through it somewhat quickly. Purpose. Again, a lot of people think that for-profits, part of their purpose is to not make a profit. And I always like to correct people that that is actually not true. We need to make sure that we have a surplus of revenue over expenses. But a nonprofit's purpose is to undertake activities whose goal is not primarily for profit. So it's always mission-based. No person owns the nonprofit. And the income from the nonprofit is not distributed to any of the owners, but it's recycled back into the nonprofit to go towards the mission and its activities. Ownership. Technically, nonprofits are owned by the public. It doesn't belong to a private person, and no one person controls the organization. It is there to serve the community. And so if a nonprofit actually dissolves, any remaining assets have to go to another nonprofit organization. It cannot go to any member or private individual. Control. So many of you probably already know this, and Gail's going to get more in depth in this in a little bit, but organizations that are nonprofits are governed by a board of directors or a board of trustees. And it's the board's job to make sure that the organization is fulfilling its purpose and mission. And the board is not supposed to act as individuals, but instead as a group. No one should be guaranteed permanent tenure on a board, and board members are not compensated. And then lastly, accountability. Gail's going to talk a little bit more about this again later as well, but all nonprofits are required to submit a form called the 990. Maybe some of you have heard of this. And that is a federal form that nonprofits must submit every year, and it includes the 5 highest paid officers or non-board members that are part of the organization. And Gail may talk a little bit. You can actually look up organizations 990s, which is a great exercise that you could do at some point. And then at the state level, the state attorney general's office oversees organizations, and they are the ones that would have the power to bring nonprofits to court if they would need to. Okay, Gail is going to talk about the board.
Awesome. Are there any questions yet? I think one thing I'd point out from what Joelle just said to keep you guys all thinking, sometimes she's going to get into fundraising later, and sometimes we feel like as a nonprofit we've got our hand out. We're just asking people to support us, please. And we don't come from a place of remembering that, one, that we do have a purpose that people want to support and are excited about, but also there are things like what she just said, foundations who actually, in part of their charter, have to give away a percentage of their funding. So what we're often trying to do is not look at it as a handout, but really matching our need of a nonprofit with the opportunity out there or someone else's passion. So I just want to point that out because it's important to me in how we approach giving. But as far as the role of the board, a board of directors is a necessary part of nonprofits. One big difference from a for-profit board to a nonprofit board is for-profit boards are compensated. Joelle just talked about non-compensated members of our nonprofit boards. They focus on achieving our mission. They provide great oversight. They generally have a variety of skills and experience. That would be the ultimate way that we would put together a board, is we look at what needs we have as an organization and match those needs. So maybe we need legal advice, financial advice, other governance options to board members who have that skill and experience. Maybe we need several people who've got direct experience with our programs. We want to make sure we have former core members or former Vistas on our board of directors, and certainly Conservation Legacy considers some of that. And they certainly are asked to provide advice, counsel, support, strategic thinking for the organization. They are usually asked in a way that we call, sometimes you'll hear the 3 W's or the 3 T's. They're asked to give of their time, talent, and treasures. That means that they are asked to give of their expertise, they're asked to give their time, and their treasures usually refers to, most boards are asked to financially support the organization. So not only are they not compensated, but they're asked to be a donor and invest in the organization and give a gift. Some organizations actually have a minimum gift that they request. Others don't, it just depends on the board. So more importantly, who is in charge? Is it the board or the staff? I'm going to give you a minute to type in what you think. Or both. We got 1 vote for the board. We've got a lot of people middle of the road. Really good feedback here. Board has to sign off on major decisions, direction from the board technically. Board says the final. So I think those are all really good feedback. Both is the way that I would represent it, but from a governance standpoint, the board does have some real fiduciary responsibilities, legal responsibilities, and the big responsibility to hire and fire the CEO or the executive director. So if you look at it from those perspectives, it may feel a little more like the board. The best operating organizations see the process of the CEO or ED with the board of directors as a collaborative approach to the work going forward, and strategic planning as part of the work from a governance side and a strategy side, I think is really important, is a shared goal between both groups. So if just the staff do strategic planning, it's probably not going to have the impact that we need. And same thing with the board if the staff are not involved, because the board has a higher level view. They don't necessarily always understand what's happening at the ground, so you need both folks in there. Okay, next slide. Great. So this is about governance and financial management. So a little bit more about our board of directors and their governing work, what impact that has and the impact of the organization, and financial oversight responsibilities. So from a governance side, they usually answer 3 fundamental questions. First, where are we headed? And that's usually from a strategic planning side. It can be as little as 2 years. It is often 5 years. It can be up to 10 years, but I don't think that in this day and age, a strategic plan that's 10 years out is really all that relevant, because we are changing way too fast. So you don't see a lot of 10-year strategic plans anymore. Operationally, they are looking at where are we now and where should we be next year. They're often helping us make some difficult operational decisions that the staff would bring to them, or they may identify themselves about are we staying focused on our mission. Some of you may have heard the words before, mission drift, where you feel like you're trying to do the work you're there for, and maybe some of you are experiencing this in your own organization and can reflect a little bit about that. But that mission drift, where all of a sudden a great idea comes maybe from a supporter, a participant, a member, someone else that really doesn't feel like it aligns with the core parts of what you do as an organization. And that board can really help you figure out where you're drifting and where you're staying on focus. Operationally, they are looking a ton at the budget and the finances. We're going to get to that a little bit more as well, but really making sure that we're staying on budget. Like I mentioned, there's fiduciary responsibilities of the board of directors, so they have to be aware of that. They're going to help set the priorities of the CEO. So the priorities for the organization from the strategic plan and the priorities from that CEO as well. Hopefully, again, in a collaborative sense would be the most effective ways. And oftentimes they're doing some work on facility management and certainly some oversight on programmatic management or governance, more programmatic governance. So hopefully those make sense to you. Again, I'm curious if anyone has seen any mission drift. So if you want to comment on that of your own experience or share here, I'd love to hear about it. But I know myself, I've had those difficult conversations where you really, it feels like an awesome program, but it might just not be aligned with what your organization is set up to do. And one way to approach that is, we're all nonprofits, we're all in this together, is to find a partner out there to help answer that request for need that you might not be able to handle that isn't in your wheelhouse. The last question that boards answer from a governing side is about accountability. How are we doing operationally and financially? How are we from a public standpoint? How do people view us? They can often be incredible advisors to how folks outside the organization are viewing us. So often as staff, we get connected and we have our own view of the organization, and what are we representing outside and between them and their networks that can really help us understand some of that. All right, oftentimes we use other metrics besides just budgets and maybe programmatic numbers, but key performance indicators. I'm going to talk about them later, but that can also help the board have a bird's eye view as to how you're doing as an organization, and if you're meeting the basic needs of the organization, as I like to say, the dashboard. So the gas is in the tank, the tires are pumped, you're ready to go. That's the governance level of a board. They're not necessarily deciding what your interior color of your leather is going to be. They're much higher level. So how do you know you have a high impact governing board? How do you know if it's working? Well, they can address complex issues together fully and timely. It's not always easy. Boards should be having healthy discussion, and they likely are going to have differences in how they view things, but they're coming together to address those complex issues, and they're not just pushing it forward. They have routine decisions that can be handled quickly, regular meetings, or if they need, there's often an executive committee of the board they can meet to help make those decisions. They have high board member satisfaction. Usually well operating boards have annual board member survey that they can look at, but they're also checking in with board members very regularly to check on their satisfaction and if what they intended for their board service is happening and what they're how they're feeling about the organization overall. You want them to be feeling good because they're going to be one of your best advocates out there. And they're working well with the CEO. Some of the areas to watch for that may have a board not operating as successfully as they'd hoped is they're just not showing up to meetings. They're not communicating, or they are showing up to meetings uninformed, and they're making reactive decisions in that case. I think either one can be really detrimental. A board that is not engaged, they may not alter what the staff are doing, but they're also not helping to promote your great work and are excited. A board that's overly engaged or even overly engaged without information can make rash decisions that aren't clear in the information and background that they need. So that's some of the pitfalls. Obviously, we hope for collaborative approaches and boards that want to get education. Conservation Legacy, for instance, one of our strategic goals is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our board is really digging in there. They're very engaged and they want to help us achieve those goals. So that would be an example of a collaborative approach to achieving a strategic goal. To get the greatest impact, as we talked about, board and staff work together. Board works together within themselves as well to decide strategy. They monitor our progress, and they support open communications. They are part of the challenges, so I'm going to put this to you all. If you take one of the nuggets you might take is it's often our tendency to hide challenges when we have them, especially maybe to a governing group like our board of directors, because we don't want to look like we can't figure it out. But that is stuff that volunteers or board members, either one, really love to dig into. They want to know what your challenges are, and that engages them and gets them passionate about the work that they're doing and want to help you push it forward. So don't hide your challenges. Be clear in where you need support. They're solution-minded, and boards that have great impact also know how to celebrate. They know how to celebrate the work they've done together and the work that the organization's done together. And then they certainly, as we talked about, they take time to share the impact of their work and connect back to their personal passion. And they're willing to open their network. So that's another important part. When they're having impact or to create bigger impact, they are connecting with all of their friends and family and telling them about the great work that they do at the organization they love. Okay, and the last one is financial oversight. A budget. How many people just love budgets? I'm one of them, but I know lots of folks out there. It is not your favorite thing, but it is an important tool for both short-term and long-term financial roadmaps. And the positive when working with a board of directors is a budget provides some flexibility to the management team in the immediate time. Certainly from an accountability side, if all of a sudden you're going off the rails and your budget said you were going to be here and you're somewhere else, then that helps alert the board of directors from a governance standpoint that we gotta ask some questions and figure out if we can help with the challenge that you have to bring you back to where we need to be. The biggest difference between a for-profit view of budget and accounting and a nonprofit view is so much of our nonprofit funds are restricted. So I know so many of you are working on capacity building for your various nonprofits and you're writing grants and other things. As much as we can approach grants with the least restriction possible, so often we want to write down to the details, but less restrictions means we can use funds where we need to, when we need to, at the biggest need, so we can adjust where we need to go. All right, I think I'm running a little bit over my time, so I'm going to stop there and go to Joelle. Next slide. Mom,
next slide is actually yours if you still want to talk about leadership and strategy. Okay.
I will do it quickly. So I talked a little bit about strategy. Like we said, it's about 3 years ahead or 5 years, not usually as much as 10. Well-implemented strategy is a living document. So if you at your organization asked for their strategic plan and they couldn't find it on their server or they dusted off something in the back room, that's not a living document. You want something that really helps you. A well-written strategic plan helps you make daily and regular decisions because it's that guideline. These are some of our strategic goals at Conservation Legacy. And so we use these again when we're making decisions or when we're asking funders for support. And I think that's it. Okay. Now to you, Joelle.
Thanks, Gail. All right, so we're going to dig a little bit into fundraising. And as Gail loves budgets, I love fundraising because to me, it's all about relationship building. So maybe some of you on this call have done some fundraising or are totally scared of fundraising, and I hopefully can help remove some of that fear because to me, it's just all about relationships. So you can see that cute little comic meme that's up there around someone saying, okay, we're going to do fundraising and hope to have that money raised by tomorrow. How many of you, maybe you can comment in the chat, have had that experience in your organizations where people are saying we need to do fundraising and they expect results the next day? You can comment in the chat if you've had that experience. I'll give you a few seconds. I'm going to pull it up so I can see. Anybody had that experience? Yes, no?
Megan said
Okay.
at least once a week.
Yeah, maybe.
Alyssa said frequently.
Okay.
And Martin said yes on short notice.
Yes.
And Josh said at his former job, it was yesterday. They wanted it yesterday. Make the money.
Good point. So much of the time it's yesterday. I have often been hired in fundraising roles where they want me to make up dollars that weren't raised, months before I got there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fundraising process and why it doesn't just happen overnight. So first of all, I like to talk about research, and research can take a lot of different forms. Some very well-funded nonprofits like universities have entire departments that focus on research. Most small nonprofits do not have that ability. So when I think of research, it's really just A, knowing your own organization, B, knowing organizations that are similar to you in your community, and then C, research around individuals, foundations, corporations, those institutions or individuals that could be your donors. 2, planning. So I have worked with a lot of organizations, either as staff or as a consultant, and they say, we don't have a development plan. And sometimes it's because there isn't the broader strategic plan that Gail was talking about before. And I always say you need to have a development plan regardless of whether there's a strategic plan. Do not wait for it. Ideally, those two would work in concert together. But if you don't have a strategic plan, you should still be working on a development plan. Always smart. And then cultivation, really, can anyone give me an example of what you think cultivation might look like in the chat? I'll give you a few seconds. What does cultivation mean to you, either at your current organizations or in past experience? Yep. Relationship building, creating relationships. Exactly. So to me, cultivation is also managing communication with either prospect or existing donors. So making sure that we are in touch with our donors, we're telling them what we're doing with their money. We are making sure that they know the impact of their giving. We are staying in touch with them constantly so that they know that they're important to our organization, that they are fueling our mission, hopefully in multiple ways, not just with their dollars. But we want to make sure that donors are feeling good about their connection to our organization. So to me, cultivation is really important. We want to make sure that they feel like they have a stake in what we're doing as an organization. So then solicitation, which in some cases may come at the same time or prior to cultivation, right? But solicitation is asking for money and then listening. I've had so many experiences with clients or board members or CEOs where they just want to sit with a funder and tell them all the reasons why they should be supporting that mission. And sometimes we do ourselves a disservice. Instead of talking at potential donors, whether foundations or individuals or corporate, that we should just really listen. What's important to them? Recently, I've been asking the question to donors for them to tell me about a gift or a project that they invested in that they feel really good about. So really wanting to hear what matters to those donors, to me, is part of solicitation. It's not me always asking, it's me listening. So solicitations can take different forms. They may be in person, they may be these days on the phone, by email, they may be online. These could be major gifts. These could be through foundation proposals. There are a lot of different ways to solicit gifts, which I'm sure many of you have experience with. And then stewardship. After you receive gifts from donors, again, whether individual, foundations, corporate, thinking about how you steward those gifts. One thing that I like to talk to people about is making sure you're following donor intent. So if I'm a donor and I give money for this particular project, even though, as Gail said, it's really important that we get gifts that are not restricted to particular projects. But if you ask me for dollars for a particular project, I give you those dollars for that project to make sure we're stewarding those dollars to go towards that project. So we want to make sure we're following what we call donor intent. And then it's that continuous reporting back to me as a donor, making sure I know what you've done with my money. And then I think a big part of stewardship is saying thank you. And Gail knows that I like to say thank you a lot, many times over and over. So why don't you say in the chat, how do you like to be thanked? Let's take a second to hear about that. Handwritten notes, love that. In person, yeah. And I actually, my biggest Achilles heel in fundraising is I have terrible handwriting. And so I am known to rewrite and rewrite thank you notes. So it takes me a long time. But a couple years ago, I started challenging myself to write thank you notes that people don't want to throw away, that don't just go in the recycling bin, but are something that people hold onto. And so I have worked really hard at those handwritten thank you notes, and I think they go a long way. I've had people tell me that my handwritten thank you notes matter, and to me that matters. So it's handwritten thank you notes for sure. It's phone calls saying thank you. It is typed letters that you then write a note. It's sending something not that costs a lot of money, but that is maybe mission relevant to those donors. I love thinking about ways to bring in the mission into our thank yous. I can talk about thanking for a long time. So I'm going to move on. Evaluation. Did we reach our goals? If not, why not? Were our goals high enough? Did we have stretch goals? Did we attain those stretch goals? How do we celebrate? How do we think about next steps and the future? Those are all part of the fundraising process. Any questions or comments before I move on? I love some of the comments going back to the thanking. One thing I didn't bring up was sort of just an annual thank you event to donors, and someone mentioned doing dinners for volunteers. That's great. And again, volunteers fit into this process as well, needing to thank them.
You know, I think, Joelle, reading through some of the comments, it's also great to see that some of these things that we could think of as stewardship might also be used for cultivation or solicitation. So somebody said, I got a personal tour, and how cool that is. I have used personal tours as cultivating options and as stewardship throughout my career. Or somebody said, I really love the photos and the videos. That I have used, and I know you have, in solicitation to associate a request for support by really connecting somebody through a video to what that work is. Or I had a personal tour for solicitation. So all of those things can go back and forth.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Absolutely. These are not rigid categories. They intersect. But I just like people to think about, so that when someone's asking them to do fundraising, you're armed with the information like, no, this is a process. It is not something that happens instantly. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Again, since many of you have lots of experience, this is probably not a surprise to you, but I wanted to put together just sources of funding that exist in the community, the different ways that nonprofits access dollars. So grants, which cover a lot of different categories, individual contributions. Some organizations have members and membership dues, government contracts, United Way, which has really shifted over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of how they give money away, earned income, and third-party payer. What's really interesting on this graphic is that you can see that fees for service and goods from private sources is the biggest. Fees for service is the biggest category, although I also see it. Oh, and that's from government. And so when I was looking at this, the reason that I think that is such a big part of the pie across the United States is from schools and hospitals, right? They charge a fee for service. And so that is why that makes up so much of this pie. When really, if you take universities and hospitals out of the equation, Most nonprofits around the country are getting a chunk of their dollars from grants, both government, private, public, individuals. And then one thing that's missing on my list are events. And one of the reasons I think I didn't have it on my list is because events should really be an opportunity for donor cultivation, for awareness building, for all kinds of things connected to fundraising. But often organizations make the mistake of thinking, we're just going to throw an event and we're going to raise a ton of money, which is not the way I like to strategically think about events. But I would say that this graphic is a little bit misleading. Most of the organizations I've worked at, they may charge some program fees or have some fees for service, but they do not make up the bulk of the way they raise money. I don't know, Gail, if you want to comment on that.
I have some on my next slide.
Perfect.
We can go to the next slide. While Trish is bringing out that next slide, I think if you guys want to comment in the chat on kind of how your nonprofit compares, your Vista host location and where their fees come from. I know that we have a mix of Vistas located at our federal partners as well as small nonprofits, and I think we'll see a variety of answers come in. So if you can see here, this could be an example of something else and aligns a little bit more with where Conservation Legacy is. We are high also on government grants and fee for service. We are really low on individual donors. This example is not Conservation Legacy specific, but it is an example. And this really is just what Joelle was just talking about, which is there is just a variety of ways that different organizations raise money. As you heard in my career, I've worked for a lot of different nonprofits. I've had organizations where 30% of our funding depended on events. I've worked alongside other organizations where 80% of their funding depended on one event, which can be really scary. I've had others which are 80% were private donors. So all of your strategy as an organization, and not just your fundraising strategy, some of your programmatic strategy is also really impacted by where your revenue comes from. It's how you share your story, and it's how you talk about your organization or how you plan some of your programming. So again, can you, we'll take a minute, can you put in the chat here kind of your comparison for your organization if you know it? If you don't, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing individual contributions and government contracts, membership dues.
Programs like, and I see Noel put in weddings and things. I know that there are great options that way. I just was visiting a local farm here in Chattanooga, Tennessee is where I'm at. And not recently, I should say. I was just visiting them several months ago before COVID. And they had a great model where they used their location to host events to get dollars, member donations, grants. That was one thing I was thinking about for all of you when we were talking earlier about fundraising. One of the things Joelle said is, you got to listen as well. And I have her same experience where so often we go and we just want to tell somebody all about our program, but we're not necessarily listening to them. So think of every funder as a partner. And with a grant funder, you can still do that. You can call up someone at the foundation and ask to learn a little bit more. You can talk to the program officer and talk about what their goals are. It is so great for them when you put a grant together and it matches the goals that they had. And one way to do that is to just go ahead and ask them and build that relationship. When your grant shows up, they're going to know your name and they're going to probably take a second glance. So large membership trail users and community members who believe in the mission. That's awesome. BLM grants, major donors, business donors, corporate dollars can be fantastic. They are, so you all know, I don't think we have another time for another question to fully figure out, but private donors actually tend to be some of your most reliable funders over time. Both corporate partners and government partners can change their priorities much more quickly than private donors actually do, which may sound like a surprise, but usually a private donor, once they've made a decision as to an organization that fits with their values, they're usually going to stay with them for a really long time.
Gail, I just wanted to add, that's why we want to make sure we're thanking our donors, because, right, once they've decided to give to us, they stick with us. Yes. If we do things right.
Awesome. Thank you guys for all giving your feedback. Okay, Trish, we can go to the next one. Next slide. So we're going to go pretty quickly through this because we want to make sure you have some time at the end to ask questions, and we should be, our goal was to be there right around now. But I'll go really quickly about some things about volunteerism, which I'm sure, again, you know a lot of. The United Nations definition, interesting enough, says it's not undertaken for financial gain. Volunteerism is under one's own free will, and it brings benefit to a third party as well as those who volunteer. This is a relatively good definition, but volunteers can be reimbursed. So that's one thing that can happen in different organizations, or they can be given stipends. I worked for an outdoor recreation organization for people with disabilities, and one of the things we gave out were ski passes, which had a value to them. So that was a level of compensation. Says they volunteer their own free will. Well, if anyone's ever been voluntold, like me, by someone you care about who wants you to volunteer somewhere, you can be coerced into volunteering. And sometimes the way that we volunteer with an organization, it can have a direct benefit, not exactly to a third party, but maybe to a family member or someone else. But as Joelle said earlier, about 25% of Americans volunteer, and their 7.9 billion hours of service equal $184 billion of donated time. Why do you think they volunteer? I think we will do a little Q&A in the question here. What do you think the main reasons people volunteer are? If you could answer in the chat. Thanks, Seth, for the cause. Feels good. I like it. To give back, to support a cause. Parents made them. That's right, to make a difference. To satisfy a passion, build a resume. Skill building is a big part. Like-minded community members, they're encouraged. To see direct positive impact. To help your community or a good cause. A couple ones that I'm seeing that we didn't quite get, related to their parents forced them, but sometimes it's to expose their children. So it's sort of a combo, and there can be some tricky inferences here that can be hard for us as an industry, where sometimes we would like to, there are donors who want their kids to see how privileged they are, so they have them volunteer with us. That's not exactly our purpose and how we want them to view things. So we often have to reframe that with families. There could be a self-esteem issue, and volunteering is really a welcome environment, which can help me kind of build up my self-esteem again, maybe after a difficult time. I think we got just connection to others is another one. And you know what? Some people volunteer because they want to be recognized. So I think we named a lot in your responses of the very positive ways people volunteer. And those are great. There are also other reasons people volunteer. It doesn't mean that they're bad volunteers, but it is really helpful to understand why somebody donates or why somebody volunteers, so that you can help keep them engaged, because you recognize if it's about recognition and they're a donor, then I put their name somewhere, or they're a volunteer, maybe I'm able to recognize them out loud at an event, and that's very important to them. And why is it important to our sector? Because it provides capacity building, because it provides that connection to personal purpose and care, that connection to others, because volunteers are certainly a source of providing funding, providing social support in social networks or social media, getting our brand out there, and ultimately because it helps advance our cause. Okay, next one. So the net cost of volunteers, some people think for the volunteer, the net cost of volunteer, some people think, well, volunteers, there's really no reward. It's all just to give out. But this isn't always true. And of course, lots of volunteers will say, as much as I give, I get back. So that's part of that net cost or net response. There can also be some material rewards. You heard me say a ski pass before. There can be reimbursement of expenses. There can be education opportunities, job skills, other benefits. So those are some of the areas for the volunteer in specific. Hopefully there are also great long-term relationships as well. For the organization, the net cost of volunteering, it can be extremely positive, and I think you all can probably reflect back on some amazing volunteer experiences either you've had or you've worked with volunteers. It can sometimes feel like it's draining, and I just want to, again, be honest and open that those opportunities show up. Oftentimes I find when we're not well positioned to host a volunteer is when our net cost, the cost seems higher than the opportunity for the positive side of volunteering. It means we haven't set up a job description. We're not quite sure who's going to supervise them. We haven't set up goals. We don't have outcomes. And we probably even haven't taken the time to make sure it's the right fit for the volunteer. So if somebody says, I want to volunteer, and you haven't asked them any questions about what their interests are, about if they can meet the skills and qualifications you need, if they can meet the timelines you need, it's usually the times when volunteering doesn't work out. It's usually when there's a misunderstanding between expectations between the volunteer and the organization. So the best thing you can do is don't rush it and wait until those expectations are clear. All right, and the little last note here, volunteerism versus social activism. One quick note on that, volunteerism targets people and activism generally targets structure. Joelle, do you want to add anything to that or to this slide?
No, that's great.
All right, that could be our last slide. Oh, nope, we have one more. Okay, so this is just for you to think about, and maybe even just one of each instead of 2 to 3. And then we'll open it up for questions. We've got about 7 minutes left. But if you want to think about in the chat kind of similarities or differences between your VISTA site and conservation legacy, that would be great. You could use that as your prompt, or if you have something else that you feel like one we didn't address, you would like to share some expertise or thoughts and your experience in nonprofit management, we'd love to take this last bit to hear from you.
I was just going to add, Gail, or if you're struggling with something with your organization that is related to something we discussed today, feel free to post that as well. Maybe we can help.
Gonna hope you're spending a little time on your similarities and differences, but again, if you have any other thoughts, we'd be happy to hear them and help think of some things. The other thing you could put in the chat if you're having trouble with similarities and differences is just, what is your most difficult challenge at your nonprofit or VISTA site right now? What is the biggest thing you're facing outside of the COVID pandemic or related to the COVID pandemic? What are you struggling with right now?
I see some coming in, Gail. So one of the questions was around tips on how to encourage engagement communication with board members. Do you want to take that one, Gail, or do you want me to?
Why don't you start and I'll see if I can add on.
Sure. Well, engaging board members is always challenging. And when I've been staff or as a consultant or as a board member myself, I always encourage the executive director or CEO to make sure that he or she is reporting back to the board what's going on with staff in between board meetings. So sometimes that may be just a twice a month email, letting board members know what's going on, which I think is really important. As a board member, I know I appreciate getting those emails. Another thing to look at is whether you have a committee structure. So sometimes it's hard for board members to engage with a big group of people, and where a lot of the work should be getting done, depending on the size of the organization, is with committees. So seeing if maybe there's a way to create a committee structure or revitalize existing committees are just some 2 quick thoughts. Anything else to add, Gail?
No, I think that's great. We've had a lot more come in. One person noted they went from a small nonprofit where the board was really active to a larger nonprofit where they're far more removed. And I know that that can be tough, and getting interaction at multiple levels is difficult, and it feels very difficult. A smaller nonprofit tends to have a more operational board, and the larger they get, the higher governance they move into. In fact, many nonprofits without staff, the board is the operations. But one thing to do in those challenges is to see if there's a board report or something else that's in board notes, and if they're available for you as a staff just to see, because it can help you to see the interesting conversation that's happening at a strategic level. And certainly in any organization I've worked with, we would gladly respond if somebody wanted to see the board packet and board notes. We would think that was great. Okay, Joelle, you want to hit another question and then I'll find one?
Yeah, I'm just going through them. One person commented on not enough staff, and I don't have a great solve for that, except one thing that I've learned over the years is I think early on in my career, I was like, I'm just gonna work as hard as I can and do the grind, and eventually they'll see how hard I work, and so then my needs will get met. And I think what I realized over the years is that if I just kept working at 125%, doing all these roles, we were never going to get additional staff, because why would we? And so instead, trying to get my work done and doing it well, but also not in a way that's complaining, but try to bring to managers above me the other needs that aren't getting met and that I didn't have the capacity to meet. So that's something you could think about, that instead of trying to overcompensate, maybe do your job and then see if you can get someone's ear around all these other things that aren't getting done.
There is such good stuff in here. One note, a couple notes on sort of involving your local community, and I'm sure that is difficult. And am I pronouncing it Araya correctly? I apologize if I don't have that correct, but I think bridging that gap and understanding how to connect and engage your local community can be really difficult. I don't think I have an easy answer, especially not in the minute that we have. Another person noted the struggle of increasing diversity in our staff and board, and I'll just share with you, Megan, that Conservation Legacy has been pretty successful in increasing our diversity in our board, but we still have a ways to go in our staff. And I think what I could offer you is, as we continue to try and figure that out within our own organization, we can share with you some of the work we're doing, and that may help your organization. And there was another note on here about Paul listed, gosh, we had to cut a department, and they were the ones that would have been doing the work of my department. And Paul, I'm sure you're working with your supervisors on this. Again, I don't think there are magic answers. I do think when organizations have a strategy or a strategic plan written, it helps you get back to kind of what your focus is, because at those times when things are cut, you have to reduce your workload in order to stay focused on the most important things, and helps you be able to prioritize. So that can be one option. I think also during, again, a pandemic that nobody estimated the challenges that we have now and that are still ahead. There's a lot of scenario planning that I know Conservation Legacy and many other organizations are doing that's helping to prepare for kind of what's next. And I'd be interested for you all to be learning from your organizations of sort of what kind of scenario planning they're doing to help anticipate the struggles that are happening. Maybe we can, I know we're a minute over, so I think we probably need to close up, but maybe there's one more question, Joelle, you can take.
Yeah, I just saw one that is about volunteers and creating a pipeline perhaps for employment. And I don't know if this is where you're going with your question, Rose, but I think that in past organizations have tried to actually use our volunteers as a pipeline towards employment. So not necessarily seeing them as totally separate, but integrating our volunteer program and thinking about ways for those people who are interested in employment could then eventually become employees. So that might be something you could think about.
And Rose, if you're also talking about sort of organizational culture, so creating a better environment for employment, we can follow up with you on some. Find us on LinkedIn or, yeah, that's probably the best place. Find us on LinkedIn, but we can connect you with some resources there that I know Joelle and I have both worked with in the past on organizational culture and development. There's so much to cover in nonprofit management, so we just try to hit the highlights. But again, I wanted to thank all of you for the great work that you're doing. I'm so proud you're associated with Conservation Legacy and excited to learn more about all the work that you're doing out there. And also know it's a really tough time to be in the positions that you are, and you are learning about flexibility, adaptability, challenge, and all those other things. And we couldn't have a better team out there to do that. So we appreciate it. We look forward to staying connected. And I don't know, from the our amazing Vista team, I want to give a shout out to you guys too. I am so thankful to get to work with such a talented team and have them help me to be successful in doing this presentation. It was a great opportunity for Joelle and I. Is there anything I've missed from you all before we sign off? All right.
I don't think so, Gail. Thanks so much to you and Joelle.
Thank you, guys.
And Vistas, before you hop off, we just want to remind you quickly about the QR code for the open space sessions. Trish, if you can throw that slide up really quick.
Yep, I'm getting you going. 1 minute.
As well